Hey, it's Jordan. Delighted to be joined by Dr. Jill Stein, who's been in the news the last few days. Green Party candidate for president in 2016, and obviously longtime peace advocate, anti-war activist, and political influencer. I don't need to kind of repeat what Hillary Clinton said. Everybody knows what she's been saying. She seems to be, I guess, trying to deflect off of some other things in the news about her and her campaign, which we'll get to a little bit later, by going after Tulsi Gabbard and then speaking as a fact, calling you a quote unquote Russian asset. I'll just ask you straight to the point. When you initially heard that, what was your reaction?
Um, it was so preposterous. She said, I'm a Russian asset, totally, totally, and that I may be blocking Tulsi's access to the Green nomination. It's like ignorant and arrogant. I'm not running, this is all over the media. I should say this is, it's public information and it can readily be found by simple Googling. I mean, it's as if Hillary's team didn't Google the obvious here. Yeah, in a way, I'm really glad that this is being uncovered, because this is a window into, it's really the tip of the iceberg in a very sick era of McCarthyism and political repression, targeting, vilifying political opponents and peace advocates, censoring the press, and warmongering. Those three things go together. Those three things are very dangerous. They really characterize our era, and it's been very hard to have a real discussion about them. And when I saw Hillary had sort of lifted the curtain on this, elephant in the room, I thought, wow, this is really great. Now we get to actually discuss this instead of having it sort of eat away at the heart of America in so many ways, from our economy to our elections to this pervasive corruption of foreign policy and decision making. It so badly begs to be brought out. My fingers are crossed that we can continue having this discussion, and I've been really surprised that, there's the usual circling the wagons around the Democratic Party machine and around Hillary and around the usual bashing against Tulsi Gabbard and myself and the Green Party. That's been, maybe it's new for Tulsi, but it's not new for me. This campaign really began against me. And it's funny, there's sort of a parallel. Tulsi's now going through what I went through, starting with my nomination, my visit to Russia, which was this, which was really the springboard for the biggest smear campaign against me, that I was a Russian asset or a spy or, a tool, colluding with the Kremlin, or an ignorant Putin puppet. All that really began when I got the nomination. I had visited Moscow in 2015 as part of a media conference that was held by RT. And this was a legitimate conference attended by media from all over the world, including the BBC, the largest TV networks in India, China TV, and so on. A whole variety of legitimate press was there, and I really wanted them to hear that there was another view, especially about the war, about the bombing campaign that Russia had just begun at that time in Syria, which I was calling for a ceasefire and a peace offensive in the Middle East. And my message actually at the time was, we know this strategy well. We've been doing this in the United States here. This has been our policy towards the Middle East. It's awful for Russia to be now following in our footsteps. This is a quagmire and it's exploding. We need to ramp this down. That conversation badly needed to happen. That's why I was there, along with promoting a global Green New Deal and a nuclear weapons ban. But
So if you were speaking out at the time against Russia bombing Syria, that would make you one pretty shoddy asset.
yeah, exactly. The whole thing was preposterous. But the point I was making was that this happened back in December of 2015, and it was all public. I was putting out newsletters and press releases about it. I was publicly raising money for it in order to do the trip. It was part of also a visit to Paris and the climate summit. I met with Jeremy Corbyn. I met with the assistant climate negotiator for China. I met with many public figures. I did not meet with Putin. I went to a conference in Moscow in order to get the message. Putin happened to sit at the head table briefly before he gave a speech in Russian, but he wasn't there to talk to anybody. I had hoped to talk to him. I wasn't able to talk to him. There was no translator. The English speakers spoke English to each other. The Russians at the table all spoke Russian to each other. There was no contact there. The whole thing was preposterous and contrary to public facts. And then, I was accused basically in the Steele report, which was the first place I saw it, the now highly discredited Steele report. But, I saw this bold-faced lie in the Steele report that Russia had sponsored my trip, and that therefore, I was on the take from Kremlin and was in this very compromised relationship with them and sort of promoting their message. And that was like false. I had the receipts to prove it. My fundraising in order to make the trip had been perfectly public. So, it was a big smear. It was clearly a political thing because it was all public knowledge well in advance, but some political operatives began tweeting about it at the time I got the nomination in July. So it was clearly a politically motivated smear, and it's kind of been waxing and waning for 2 years, 3 years, and I'm really grateful to have a chance to discuss this publicly. It's not about me, I'm like an incidental factoid here in a mountain of information, and far greater concerns than the smear campaign against me is what this says about who's controlling U.S. foreign policy, censorship, and manipulation of the U.S. public. Yes, Russians are probing our vulnerabilities constantly in all areas, as we are doing to them, as most capable democracies and countries are doing to each other. And you can just take a look at the Oxford University's reports. They have a whole series of reports on this, which are very good and put the whole thing into perspective. The Senate Intelligence Committee reports, like the information presented to the Mueller committee, it looks at one particular window and it blows. It's like, oh, I'm shocked, shocked that there are manipulative Russian messages out there. Oh, shock, The reality is this is what the internet looks like. This is what social media looks like. By any realistic measure, Russia's interference in social media, as in the election, is really pretty small change compared to the real sources of interference. So just to put out to underscore that point first about social media, the U.S. budget. Well, let me say first, the entire Russian budget for social media interference, adventures, whatever you call it, is $12 million per year. The U.S. budget is more like $200 million per year, and perhaps much greater than that, but that's what's been specifically identified. Israel's is $100 million. So we're the big players here. Russia's kind of a bit player. And yeah, no doubt they're probing our social media. Whether it's official or unofficial, I think isn't clear at this point. But yeah, there's a lot of nefarious adventures going on out there. Not even to call it adventures. I don't mean to minimize it. There's nefarious stuff, but we're very much a part of that. And in fact, the rules, we used to be protected here in the U.S. We used to be protected at least from propaganda on the part of our own government. Those protections were repealed in 2013. And what is that? How much of that $200 million social media budget, is going to the likes of Clint Watts, and his organization? He was a former military propagandist trying to propagandize in the Middle East, to a huge budget. And then now he's kind of cashing in as a private contractor to provide these tools no doubt, to the U.S. government, the Atlantic Council, who knows, who's all in on this. We don't exactly know, but there's a lot of countercurrents out there on social media and in legacy media. We need to be skeptical consumers, and we need to hear all points of view. Regrettably, the really thoughtful and broad point of view, like that you represent, or Aaron Mate, or Glenn Greenwald, or Max Blumenthal, and others with, particularly with the Gray Zone Project and Consortium News and so on. People who are really looking at this more broadly, they're being completely suppressed here, which again ties us back to why I'm glad, why Hillary Clinton has done us such a favor to lift the veil on this cancer of McCarthyism that's really, it's destabilizing our foreign policy. It is interfering with our press freedoms and our communications here at home. And this is dangerous at a time when the military budget is consuming 60% of our discretionary budget, 60% and growing, supported by Democrats as well as Republicans. When we are bombing 7 countries and on the verge of many more, when we have special operations in something like 70 or 80 countries right now around the world, we are the empire, like the world has never seen. This has a huge cost, not only to our financial budget, but to our democracy, to our very survival into the 21st century. So thank you, Hillary Clinton, for enabling a greater public discussion of this very critical and timely problem.
I'd like to ask you, because this phrase really grates at me, this sowing chaos, sowing discord, because I don't know, I'm just a very common sense person. I covered the campaign in 2016. You and I have spoken about it quite a bit. And, I was in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, and just little markers that at the time you think about it, I don't really see any Clinton lawn signs. I see a lot of Trump signage all over the place. When I go to Hillary Clinton events at colleges, it's mostly older people. They're not getting many students out. These things that add up to show an enthusiasm gap have nothing to do with a foreign country. So it's not even quantifiable. Aaron Mate has spoken about this, I think, very brilliantly. There's like memes of Jesus from fake Russian pages and things like that. It's not even quantifiable. There's no way to even quantify whether things somebody sees on social media has any influence on voting behavior. But one thing that does is if your job got sent to Mexico or China, or your plant has been closed down, or your YMCA has been closed down. I'd like to ask you, because to me, this sowing chaos nonsense, which is part of that McCarthyism, is really just a deflection from the main issue, a phony populist, in my view. Now we're seeing, a growing fascist, conned a lot of people into thinking he was the everyman speaking for them.
Exactly. And why were people vulnerable to that kind of demagoguery? This is exactly the demagoguery from Trump, his false populism. This is a classic textbook example of how fascism takes hold. It's always in the presence, not always, but usually in the face of incredible economic and social despair. We got that despair right now, big time. Whether you're looking at the economic hardships, where by any real measure, almost half of Americans are in or near poverty, are extremely insecure about their economic status if they're not already downwardly mobile. Half of Americans basically don't have access to health care. Either they can't afford it at all or they can't afford to use it. An entire generation of young people and not so young people are held hostage by unpayable student debt. We've got a real crisis on our hands, and mortality is going way up among those people who are being hit hard economically. And we've got an epidemic of opioid use and drug overdoses and depression and suicides. It's no secret that we are in very dark times. And it's also no secret that that's been, brought to us courtesy of both political parties, mainstream parties that are serving the economic elite. So, Trump was able to play on that on that outrage, most recently against Barack Obama for having bailed out the banks and not the 6 or 7 million homeowners who were basically cheated out of their homes. So there still is incredible outrage. The Wall Street Journal had a poll about a month ago showing that it's 70% who aren't just, quote, fed up. They are self-described as, as angry at the bipartisan political system for screwing them. So, it's like John Kennedy saying comes to mind that those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. We are a pressure cooker that is getting ready to explode. And what the strategy of the imperialists, the oligarchs, the militarists, the proponents of empire, their strategy is to shut down on these basic democratic vehicles for discussion, for democratic debate, and for change. They're trying to block political change because they are very afraid that their track record is catching up with them and that they're going to be booted out the minute people have a choice. And this is why I think, Hillary Clinton didn't just leave this at Tulsi Gabbard. She needed to smear me too, to say, if you go to a third party, or if you even support a third party, we're coming after you. Be very afraid of exercising your political freedom. Be very afraid. And, we see this playing out all over the place. Not only the complicity of the mainstream media, but in just everyday conversations. People who haven't locked into the Trump camp are kind of lost at sea right now. They don't know what to do. They're terrified. They don't like where the mainstream political system and the Democrats are going, but they cling to this kind of Santa Claus hope of change inside the Democratic Party. And I say Santa Claus hope because I personally find it impossible to suspend disbelief. After almost a century of this constant betrayal of progressive saviors who are always held up, from Henry Wallace during the Second World War to Jesse Jackson to Bernie Sanders. We have progressive saviors who are allowed to be seen and heard, but then they get smacked down. This is the game plan here, folks. How many times do we have to go through it and fail to recognize we need to start organizing on firm ground, that they can't just pull out from under us every election. So people are scared. They're very scared because we're in this bipartisan system, this lesser evil voting system that makes you worry, will my vote have unintended consequences? Now, it was clear in 2016, people who voted for me were not otherwise going to come out and vote. They weren't taken away from anybody. But more to the point, there were 100 million people who wouldn't vote at all. 100 million who are disproportionately black, brown, millennial, and poor. Did Russia get to all of them and tell them, not to vote? I don't think so. What an insult. People are acting, on their own deeply felt experience and hungering for something else, like that Wall Street Journal poll told us. 70%, are angry at the political system that has thrown them under the bus. So what does the political system do? It tries to shut down all other options by essentially equating progressives with Trump. And the solution here, I just want to put it on the table because this isn't so complicated. This isn't rocket science. The state of Maine has already passed ranked choice voting. Even if you share Hillary Clinton's paranoia that the Russians are around every corner, well, this is a great way to disrupt any evil foreigner's secret plan to co-opt a presidential candidate, a progressive presidential candidate, and split the Democrats' vote, so-called. That can't happen under ranked choice voting. It makes vote splitting impossible. It lets you rank your choices. If your first choice loses, your vote is automatically reassigned to your second choice. There's going to be no spoiling of the vote, no unintended consequences. So even the Russia baiters should be out there now pounding the pavement for ranked choice voting. If we bailed out Wall Street to the tune of almost $1 trillion at the time of the crash, almost $1 trillion over the course of what, 3 or 4 days? Could we not make a critical patch to our voting system over the course of the next month? This could happen right now. Voting machines are still being purchased, which is a whole other story, but we're trying to get good, unhackable voting machines that use paper ballots. So the systems are just now coming online. It's not too late to introduce ranked choice voting like Maine has done, and it's really interesting to look at their election, where there's a wonderful green peace advocate running against Susan Collins in the Senate race for Susan Collins' seat. It's like a 3-4 or might even be a 5-way race. There's some independents, but Maine has elected independents before. Their other senator is nominally an independent right now, Angus King. So this, the peace candidate has a real fighting chance. She's being treated very seriously by the media. And it's a little case study in what would happen if we actually liberated our votes, if we actually expanded our political freedom to the freedom we should have to be able to lead with our values. Democracy needs a moral compass. If we can't bring that into our elections, when do we have it? So we can do that. And I think it's, thank you, Hillary Clinton, for enabling us to have this conversation publicly.
Hope you enjoyed that last video. Hop on over to statuscoup.com where you can sign up for our email list and become a member for as low as $5 to $10 a month. Membership is how we grow. That's statuscoup.com/join. And remember, join our email list so we can grow the revolution with you.